$214,000 by Monday. Pay the mortgage or get out. My father said that to me in a hallway at my mother's funeral. I was still in black. The dirt from her grave was still on my shoes. He hadn't cried once. I didn't argue. I didn't beg. I walked past him into the living room where 40 of their closest friends were still holding reception plates, and I plugged my mother's flash drive into the 65-inch screen above the fireplace. I didn't cry. I pressed play. What those 40 people watched in the next 9 minutes cost my father the house, the inheritance he'd already quietly moved, and every single person in that room who still believed his version of their marriage. His hands went white around his glass. He said my name once. Then he stopped talking. Before I go on, take a moment to like and subscribe, but only if this story speaks to you. Drop your location and local time in the comments. Now let me take you back to the night my mother pressed that flash drive into my palm and said, "You'll know exactly when it's time." My name is Alina. I'm 28 years old, and for the last 3 years, my life was measured in milligrams, heart rate monitors, and the specific sound of my father's golf shoes hitting the hardwood floor. In our house, there was a law. It wasn't written down, but it was reinforced every time a medical bill arrived in the mail. The law was simple. Dad had sacrificed his retirement, his peace, and his future to keep Mom alive, so I had to sacrifice mine to keep the house running. I moved back home the day Mom's diagnosis turned from treatable to terminal. I gave up my apartment in the city, packed my laptop, and set up my desk in the corner of the guest room, right next to the stacks of adult diapers and oxygen tanks. I worked 40 hours a week as a data analyst, and the other 128 hours, I was a nurse, a cook, and a bank account. The household care fund is light this month, Alina, my father, Richard, would say. He'd stand in the kitchen doorway, wearing a moisture-wicking polo shirt and those pristine white golf shoes, scrolling through his phone. I just moved another $10,000 from my IRA to cover the specialist in Houston. It's a drop in the bucket, really. I'm bleeding out here. He'd sigh, a long, practiced sound that usually ended with him looking at the ceiling as if checking for God's approval. Then he'd slide a printed bank statement across the granite island. "I need 80% of your check this Friday," he'd say. "It's the only way we keep the lights on for her." I never questioned it. How could I? I watched my mother, Claire, shrink into the pillows in the living room. I watched her hair thin and her skin turn the color of parchment. If Richard said he was broke, I believed him. If Richard said he was a martyr, I worked harder to be a better disciple. I'd log into my payroll portal, change the direct deposit settings, and watch my hard-earned money vanish into the Richard Townsend household management account. I lived on coffee and the $20 I'd hide in my phone case for emergencies. But Mom was watching, too. Even when she couldn't speak, her eyes followed Richard. She'd watch him check his watch, a heavy gold piece he claimed was a pre-diagnosis gift to himself, and she'd watch the way he'd loudly complain about the cost of her organic broth while he waited for his tea time. One Tuesday in late August, Richard was out. Dee told the neighbors he was going to a caregiver support group, but the smell of cigar smoke on his jacket when he left told a different story. Aunt Helen, my mom's older sister, was over. She was the only person Richard couldn't intimidate with a sigh. Helen was in the kitchen making tea. She looked at the new, high-end espresso machine on the counter, a necessity for the long nights, according to Dad, and then she looked at me. I was wearing a sweatshirt I'd had since college and trying to figure out if I could stretch my last $5 until payday. She didn't say a word. She just walked over, took my hand, and pressed a folded $100 bill into my palm. "Keep something for yourself, Ellie," she whispered, her eyes darting toward the hallway. "He's not telling you everything, he never has." I tried to give it back, but she closed my fingers over it. Just keep it. You're going to need a way out eventually. That night, after Helen left and Richard was snoring in the master bedroom, I sat by Mom's bed. The house was quiet, save for the rhythmic hum of the oxygen concentrator. Mom reached out, her hand trembling, and gripped my wrist with surprising strength. She reached under her pillow and pulled out a heavy, industrial-looking metal flash drive. It felt cold and weighted in my hand. "Don't open it until I'm gone," she whispered. Her voice was a dry rattle, but her eyes were the sharpest I'd seen them in months. "You'll know exactly when it's time. He thinks he's built a cage, Alina. I built a key." I tucked the drive into the secret pocket of my work bag, my heart hammering against my ribs. I didn't know then that the medical fund was a fiction or that the house I was paying for wasn't even legally his to lose. 3 days later, the heart monitor in the living room hit a single, flat note. It was 4:14 in the morning. I was holding Mom's hand, feeling the heat leave her skin. I stood up to wake my father, but as I reached the hallway, I saw the light on in his office. I stopped. The door was cracked. Richard wasn't crying. He wasn't praying. He was sitting at the desk, frantically pulling folders out of Mom's filing cabinet, tossing her personal correspondence into a shredder as fast as the blades could take them. He had a glass of scotch next to him and a look of pure, calculated relief on his face. That was the moment I realized the funeral wouldn't be the end of the tragedy. It was just the opening act for the real heist. The morning after my mother died was the quietest the house had been in 3 years. There was no hum of the oxygen machine, no rattling breath, no clink of medicine spoons. But the silence didn't feel like peace. It felt like a held breath. I sat at the kitchen island, staring into a cup of black coffee that had gone cold an hour ago. I was waiting for the funeral director to call back, waiting for the reality to sink in, waiting for my father to stop being a ghost in his own house. Richard came down the stairs at 8:30 sharp. He wasn't wearing pajamas or a robe. He was dressed in a crisp navy golf polo and khakis, his hair combed back with military precision. He didn't look like a man who had lost his wife of 32 years 4 hours ago. He looked like a man heading to a board meeting. He didn't offer a hug. He didn't ask if I'd slept. He walked straight to the printer in his office, grabbed a stack of warm paper, and marched into the kitchen. "We need to talk about the transition, Alina," he said. He didn't sit. He stood over me, his shadow stretching across my cold coffee. "Transition?" I asked, my voice cracking. "Dad, the body isn't even. We haven't even picked out a casket yet." "Life doesn't stop because the heart does," he said, and for a second he sounded like a motivational poster from hell. He slid the top sheet of paper toward me. It wasn't a funeral plan. It was a spreadsheet. "Your mother gone, the household dynamic changes. The caregiving era is officially closed." I looked down. At the top of the page, in bold letters, it said, "Repayment and tenancy agreement." "What is this?" "It's reality," Richard said, tapping a pen against the granite. "I've spent 3 years sinking every liquid asset I had into her experimental trials and the home nursing staff. I've reached the bottom of the well. This house is a liability now, and frankly, you've been living here as a guest." "A guest?" I stood up so fast my chair screeched against the tile. "I've been working 40 hours a week and then doing 12-hour shifts in that living room. I've been giving you 80% of my salary for 3 years, Dad. Where did that money go?" His eyes narrowed. It was a look I'd seen him give waiters and car salesmen, a look of practiced, superior disappointment. "It went to keeping her comfortable," he snapped. "Do you have any idea what a private ventilator costs? What the out-of-network specialists charged? You contributed, Alina, but don't act like you carried the load. You were a helper. I was the provider." He pointed to the middle of the spreadsheet. "Since you're no longer providing care, you are now legally a tenant. This is a bill for back rent for the last 36 months, adjusted for the care discount I gave you, plus your share of the utilities and a structured repayment plan for the six-figure medical debt I absorbed on your behalf." The number at the bottom was staggering. It wasn't just a bill, it was a life sentence. He wanted me to sign a document acknowledging I owed him nearly $250,000. "I'm not signing this," I whispered. "I need to go to the florist. I need to call Aunt Helen. I need to plan a funeral for the woman who raised me." Richard's face didn't soften. If anything, it turned to stone. He leaned in, his knuckles white against the kitchen island. "You'll sign it, or you'll find somewhere else to mourn," he said, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous register. "Funerals cost money, Alina, money you don't have anymore. If you want a seat in the front row, you start acting like a daughter who understands sacrifice." I grabbed my car keys and my purse, my hands shaking so hard I dropped them twice. I had to get out of that kitchen. I had to breathe air that didn't smell like his expensive aftershave and the ink of that predatory contract. "I'm going to the florist," I said, walking toward the door. "White lilies, that's all I care about right now." "Lilies are expensive," he called out after me. "Better check your balance, Alina. I've already updated the household accounts." I didn't know what he meant until I got to the car and realized I didn't even have enough gas to get across town. I reached for my phone to check my banking app, but my finger hovered over the screen. He said the caregiving era was over. I didn't know yet that he'd already started the era of my erasure. I drove to the florist with my knuckles white against the steering wheel. I needed to see the white lilies. I needed to smell something that wasn't antiseptic or my father's expensive cologne. The florist, a kind woman named Sarah who had done the arrangements for every birthday party my mother ever threw, looked up from a bucket of eucalyptus as I walked in. Her smile faltered, turning into something pitying. "Alina, honey," she said, wiping her hands on her apron. "I'm so sorry about Claire, truly." "Thank you, Sarah," I said, leaning against the refrigerated glass case. "I want to order the white lilies, the large ones, for the casket and the altar. Mom always said they smelled like Sunday mornings." Sarah looked down at her order book, her expression shifting from pity to something more uncomfortable. "Oh, Alina, your father called about 20 minutes ago, Well, he said you were going through a bit of a crisis. A selfish phase, he called it." I felt the blood drain from my face. "A selfish phase?" "He said he was taking over the arrangements to ensure things were handled appropriately," she whispered, not meeting my eyes. "He canceled the lilies. He said they were an unnecessary extravagance and that he'd be going with the carnation sprays from the funeral home standard package instead. He canceled her favorite flowers." "I'm sorry, sweetie." "He's the one who paid the deposit this morning." I reached into my purse and pulled out my debit card. My hands were shaking. "I'll pay for them right now. Keep the lilies on the order. I don't care what he said." Sarah sighed and walked over to the terminal. I swiped the card. I waited for the familiar beep of a successful transaction. Instead, the screen flashed red, declined. "Try it again," I said. "Maybe the chip is dirty." I swiped it again, declined, contact issuer. I felt a cold sweat prickle at the back of my neck. I opened my banking app. For 3 years, I had been depositing my salary into a joint household account that Richard controlled. My name was on the account. I was a co-owner. I should have had over $4,000 in there from my last 2 paychecks alone. The balance read, $0.00. I tapped the transaction history. At 8:14 a.m., exactly when Richard was handing me that spreadsheet in the kitchen, there had been a total balance transfer. Every cent of my savings, my emergency fund, and my mother's final disability payment had been moved to an account ending in numbers I didn't recognize. My phone buzzed in my hand. It was a text from Richard. "Actions have consequences, Alina. If you want to play at being an independent adult, you can start by paying your own way." Grow up and pay your debts. I've removed your access to the household funds until we reach an agreement on the back rent. I stood in the middle of the flower shop, surrounded by the scent of things I couldn't afford to buy for my dead mother. I looked at Sarah, who was pretending to be very busy with a ribbon. The humiliation was a physical weight pressing down on my chest. I'll have to call you back, I managed to say. I walked out of the shop and back to my car. I turned the key. The engine groaned, sputtered, and died. The fuel light glowed an angry, steady amber. I had maybe 2 miles of range left, and the house was 5 miles away. I sat in the driver's seat and looked at my phone. I didn't even have enough in my personal account for an Uber. Richard hadn't just taken my money, he'd taken my mobility. He was stripping the gears of my life one by one until I was forced to crawl back to the kitchen table and sign that paper. I didn't call him. I wouldn't give him the satisfaction of hearing me beg. I started walking. It was a gray, miserable afternoon. About 2 miles in, the sky opened up. A cold, biting autumn rain began to fall, soaking through my thin cardigan and plastering my hair to my neck. I walked past the country club where Richard played every Saturday. I walked past the boutiques where he bought his silk ties. I walked until my legs burned and my shoes were ruined. By the time I reached our driveway, I was shivering violently. My clothes were heavy with rainwater. All I wanted was a hot shower and to crawl into my bed in the guest room. I reached the front porch and pulled my keys from my pocket. I slid the silver key into the deadbolt. It wouldn't turn. I tried the bottom lock. It wouldn't even enter the keyway. I looked closely at the hardware. The brass was shiny and new. Richard hadn't just locked the door, he'd replaced the entire handle and deadbolt assembly while I was out. I hammered on the door. "Dad, open the door, it's raining, Dad." The house remained silent. The lights were on in the living room. I could see the glow of the television, probably the golf channel. He was in there. He heard me. I walked around to the back patio, my feet squelching in the mud. The sliding door was locked. The kitchen window was latched. I was a stranger to the house I had spent 3 years maintaining. I stood under the eaves of the detached garage, trying to stay out of the downpour. I checked my phone. 12% battery. I looked at the garage. It was an old structure, built in the 50s, with a small side window that didn't latch right. I knew that window. I used to sneak out of it when I was 17. I didn't know yet that the man inside the house was already drafting a eulogy that would make him look like a saint and me look like a ghost. It took me 20 minutes to get the garage window open. The wood was swollen from the rain, and my fingers were so numb I could barely grip the frame. When it finally gave way, I tumbled inside, landing on a pile of old potting soil bags. The air in the garage smelled like oil, wet concrete, and the cedar mulch Richard used for the flower beds. I didn't turn on the overhead light. I didn't want him to see the glow from the house and realize I'd found a way in. Instead, I used the flashlight on my phone, 4% battery left, to navigate to the corner where we kept the outdoor furniture during the winter. I dragged a set of faded, moth-eaten patio cushions into the space between the lawnmower and the workbench. I sat there in the dark, my wet clothes heavy and freezing against my skin. I was the woman who had managed a 6-figure household budget for 3 years, who had coordinated with oncologists and hospice nurses, and now I was hiding in a garage because I couldn't afford a hotel room or a gallon of gas. I was $35 away from total insolvency. The floor was cold. My chest felt tight, a physical pressure that made it hard to draw a full breath. I felt like I was disappearing. If I stayed in this garage and never came out, would Richard even notice? Or would he just be annoyed that the lawn wasn't mowed on time? My phone buzzed. One final, desperate vibration before the screen went black. It was an old notification, a on-this-day memory from my cloud storage. I tapped it with a trembling thumb. It was a voicemail from 4 years ago, back before the diagnosis, back when Mom was still the one who held the map for our family. I pressed my ear to the cold speaker. "Ellie, it's Mom." Her voice came through, clear and warm, untainted by the rasp of the oxygen tubes. "I'm just calling to say I'm so proud of that promotion. You're so smart, honey. You have your grandmother's spine. Don't ever let anyone tell you that you don't deserve the space you take up. I love you, Ellie. I made sure you're going to be okay. I promise." The line clicked dead. The phone followed suit, the screen flickering once and then dying. I pulled my knees to my chest and cried. Not the quiet, dignified sob of a grieving daughter, but the ragged, ugly wail of someone who had reached the absolute floor of her life. I cried for the lilies. I cried for the $0 balance. I cried because my mother was gone, and the man who was supposed to protect me was currently watching television while I shivered on a patio cushion. As I shifted my weight, I felt something hard and cold press against my hip. I reached into the pocket of my soaked cardigan. My fingers closed around the heavy, industrial metal of the flash drive. "I built a key," she had said. I looked at the house. The lights in the kitchen flickered off. Richard was going to bed. He was sleeping in a climate-controlled room under a down comforter while I was a squatter in his peripheral vision. I didn't have a computer, I didn't have power, but I had the drive and I had the morning. I tucked the drive back into my pocket and lay down on the cushions. I didn't sleep, not really. I just waited for the sun to give me enough light to see the way out. The morning of the funeral, I woke up in a gas station bathroom. My back was a roadmap of aches from the garage cushions, and my skin felt tacky and tight. I had exactly $3.40 left after buying a cup of coffee to justify staying in the stall long enough to change. I pulled my black dress out of my bag. It was wrinkled, smelling faintly of the damp garage, but I smoothed it out with my palms. I brushed the dried graveyard dirt off my shoes with a paper towel. As I looked at my reflection in the scratched, yellowed mirror, I didn't see the broken girl from the night before. I saw a woman who was technically homeless and penniless, but who was still standing. I didn't know yet how far the rot had spread. I walked the half-mile to the church. As I approached the stone steps, I saw the first sign of the infection. Sarah, the florist, was unloading a van. She caught my eye and immediately looked at the pavement. "I'm sorry about the flowers, Alina," she murmured as I passed. "Your father, he told me you were having some kind of episode. He said you were trying to sabotage the service because of the inheritance dispute. He paid for the carnations in cash." I felt a cold prickle of dread. "Inheritance dispute? Sarah, there is no dispute." She didn't answer. She just hoisted a plastic-wrapped vase and hurried toward the side entrance. The lobby of the church was worse. This was the social arena my father had spent 30 years cultivating. He was the deacon, the good man who always helped with the roof repairs and the bake sales. When I walked into the vestibule, the air seemed to thin. Usually these people, moms from my childhood soccer team, the elderly couples who sat in the same pew for decades, would have rushed to hug me. Instead, they performed a synchronized dance of avoidance. Mrs. Gable, who used to bake me cookies, saw me coming and suddenly became intensely interested in a stack of hymnals. My cousins, David and Mark, men I used to play tag with, didn't move toward me. They moved toward my father. They stood flanking him like human shields, their expressions grim and protective. Richard was in the center of the room, holding a linen handkerchief. He wasn't crying, but he was doing the heavy-eyed martyr routine perfectly. "It's just been so hard," I heard him whisper to the pastor. The financial strain of the care was one thing, but Alina, the way she's reacted to the loss. "She's become so entitled, so erratic. I'm worried for her soul, Pastor, I really am." The pastor nodded, his hand on Richard's shoulder. Loss manifests in ugly ways, Richard. You're a saint for carrying her burden on top of your own. I stood 10 feet away, a ghost in a wrinkled dress. I wanted to scream. I wanted to tell them that the burden he was carrying was paid for by 80% of my salary. I wanted to tell them about the garage window and the spreadsheet. But I knew how it would look. I was the disheveled daughter, the erratic one. He was the pillar of the community in a perfectly tailored suit. The service began. I walked down the aisle toward the front row, toward the seat that belonged to me as the only child. My cousin David stepped into the aisle, blocking my path. "The front row is for the immediate family who supported her, Alina," he said, his voice low and hard. "Uncle Richard thinks it's best if you sit a few rows back, to keep things peaceful." I looked at my father. He didn't look back. He was staring at the closed casket, his jaw set in a display of stoic grief. He had briefed everyone. He had turned my own family into his bouncers. I sat in the 5th row, between a woman I didn't know and a stack of funeral programs. I listened as the pastor praised Richard's lone financial sacrifice and unwavering devotion. He spoke about the heavy cost of love and how Richard had emptied his life for Claire. Every word was a stone thrown at me. Every amen from the crowd was a confirmation that the lie had taken root. By the time we moved to the graveside, I wasn't just grieving my mother. I was watching my entire history being rewritten by a man who had replaced the locks on my life. After the burial, as the crowd began to murmur about the reception back at the house, I felt a hand on my arm. It was my father. He leaned in, the scent of expensive peppermint on his breath. "The car is waiting for me," he whispered. "Don't make a scene at the house. If you show up and act like a guest, I'll let you stay in the guest room for one night to pack your things. If you start talking about your money again, I'll have the police remove you for trespassing. This is your last chance to be a daughter, Alina. Don't waste it." He walked away before I could respond, his white golf shoes crunching on the gravel of the cemetery path. I looked at the freshly turned earth of my mother's grave. I looked at the dirt still on the toes of my shoes. I realized then that the house wasn't just a building anymore. It was the lion's den, and I was going back in. I didn't take the limousine to the reception. I didn't want to be trapped in a leather-seated cage with my father's silence. Instead, I walked the 4 blocks from the cemetery to the house, the mud from the graveside still clinging to the heels of my shoes. By the time I reached the driveway, the street was already lined with Lexuses and SUVs. The performance had moved to its primary stage. I didn't enter through the front door where the grieving widower was receiving hugs. I slipped through the back patio door, the one Richard had forgotten to rebolt in his haste to get to the church. The kitchen was a chaos of silver platters and half-empty wine bottles. I could hear the low, respectful hum of 40 people in the living room, punctuated by the occasional clink of a fork against a reception plate. I retreated to the corner of the kitchen, trying to stay out of the sightline of the hallway. I felt like a ghost haunting my own life. I grabbed a paper towel and began scrubbing the cemetery dirt off my shoes, my hands shaking so hard I nearly tore the paper. "You're not a servant, Alina. Stop scrubbing." I jumped, nearly dropping my shoe. Aunt Helen was standing by the swinging door, her arms crossed over her black lace dress. She didn't look like the other guests. She didn't look sad, she looked dangerous. She stepped into the kitchen and turned the deadbolt on the back door, locking us in. "Aunt Helen," I whispered, my voice breaking. "He told everyone I was erratic. He told them I was trying to steal from him." "I heard what he said," Helen said, her voice a sharp, clean blade. "I also saw him buying a $5,000 watch 3 weeks ago while you were crying in the grocery store because you couldn't afford the good vitamins for your mother." She walked over to me, took the ruined paper towel out of my hand and tossed it in the trash. Then she reached into the refrigerator, pulled out a plate of actual food, turkey, artisan cheese, and fruit, and set it on the counter. She poured a cup of tea from the pot I'd brewed for the guests and pushed it toward me. "Eat," she commanded. "You look like a stiff breeze would knock you over. You look just like Claire when she was angry. She used to get very quiet right before she leveled a room." The warmth of the tea hit my stomach, and for the first time in 48 hours, the shivering stopped. Helen leaned against the counter, watching the door. "He thinks he won," she said softly. "He thinks because he has the church ladies and the cousins in his pocket, the truth is whatever he says it is. But Claire knew he'd try this. She knew he was siphoning your checks. She knew about the support group meetings that were actually dinner dates." Helen reached into her small clutch purse and pulled out a folded piece of stationery. She slid it across the granite. On it was a complex 16-character password written in my mother's neat, sloping cursive. "Your mother told me to give you this today. She said the drive was only half the battle. You need the key to the vault." Helen glanced at the counter where the television remote sat. "The TV in the living room is a smart model. It has a USB port on the side. Richard bought it with your April bonus, remember?" I looked at the password, then at the heavy metal drive in my pocket. The weight of it suddenly felt different. It wasn't a burden anymore. It was a weapon. "Go to your laptop, Alina," Helen said, her hand resting briefly on my shoulder. "Check the files. Ensure you have the stomach for what's in there. Because once you walk into that living room and press play, there is no going back to being his daughter." "I haven't been his daughter for a long time," I said. "I've just been his ATM." I pulled my laptop from my work bag, which I'd hidden in the pantry the night before. I sat on the floor behind the kitchen island, plugged in the drive, and typed in the password. The screen flickered. A folder appeared, labeled simply, "For the Monday after." I clicked the first file. It wasn't a medical bill. It was a copy of an ironclad living trust. My eyes scanned the legal jargon, landing on the section titled Real Property. This house had been purchased entirely with Claire's inheritance from my grandfather. Richard's name wasn't on the deed. He'd signed a quitclaim 10 years ago in exchange for Claire covering his failed business debts. 2 weeks before she died, Claire had executed the transfer. The house didn't belong to Richard. It belonged to me. He wasn't the landlord, he was a squatter. The second folder was a series of bank ledgers. It showed my direct deposits entering the household fund and within 2 hours being wired out. Not to hospitals, not to pharmacies. The money was being sent to a property management company in Boca Raton, Florida, for a luxury condo under the name R. Townsend and M. Vance. My breath hitched. I knew that name. Monica Vance was the grief counselor Richard had recommended to me 6 months ago. The final file was a video. I hovered the cursor over it, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. I could hear Richard's voice in the other room, booming and warm, telling a story about how he'd held Mom's hand until the very end. "He's giving the closing speech," Helen whispered, peering through the crack in the door. "He's about to ask everyone to raise a glass to his beloved Claire." I closed the laptop and stood up. I gripped the metal drive so hard the edges bit into my palm. "I'm ready," I said. I stayed behind the kitchen island for 20 minutes, scrolling through the digital trail of my mother's final weeks. The truth was staggering, a cold, hard architecture of betrayal. File 1 was the leverage that changed the gravity of the room. It was an ironclad living trust, drafted by a high-stakes firm in the city, not our local family lawyer. The house was bought with Claire's inheritance, and she had moved it into a separate trust years ago. 2 weeks before she died, she had executed a transfer of the deed. Richard wasn't the landlord. He was a squatter in a house that now belonged entirely to me. File 2 was the ledger. It was a meticulous accounting of every cent I had contributed to the household fund. Richard had never paid a dime for the experimental treatments. Medicare and a secondary private policy Claire kept secret had covered everything. Every single one of my paychecks, the 80% I had surrendered while eating gas station protein bars, had been wired directly to a property management group in Florida. He was building a retirement nest for himself and a woman named Monica while I was sleeping on a garage floor. "He's starting the toast," Aunt Helen whispered, her eye pressed to the crack in the kitchen door. "He's doing the part where he talks about the financial burden he bore to show his love." I felt a strange, cold calm settle over me. The trembling in my hands stopped. This wasn't a tragedy anymore. It was a crime scene, and I was the only one with the forensic evidence. "I'm not just going to stop him," I said, looking at the heavy metal drive. "I'm going to erase the version of him that everyone in that room believes in." I didn't need a lawyer to tell me what I had. I had bank statements, property deeds, and a video that Claire had titled the Monday after. I checked the smart TV settings on my laptop, ensuring the local network was open. Richard had set up the 65-inch screen above the fireplace as a centerpiece for his grief slideshow, but he'd left the USB port and the screen share permissions wide open. "He's asking for silence," Helen said, her voice tight. "Elena, if you're going to do this, you do it now." I closed the laptop. I didn't feel like a victim. I felt like a technician. I walked to the kitchen door and looked through the glass. Richard was standing in front of the fireplace, a glass of expensive crystal in his hand. He looked weary, dignified, and utterly in control. 40 people, the people who had known my mother for decades, were looking at him with tears in their eyes. They saw a hero. I heard him say my name. "And to my daughter, Elena, who is struggling so deeply with the cost of this loss, I want you to know that the debt doesn't matter. The house is just wood and stone. Your family is here to carry you." A murmur of sympathy rippled through the room. A few people looked toward the kitchen, their eyes full of that terrible, condescending pity. I looked at the dirt on my shoes, then at the flash drive in my hand. "The debt doesn't matter," I whispered to myself, "because it doesn't exist." I stepped out of the kitchen. I didn't run. I didn't shout. I walked with the steady, measured pace of someone who knew exactly how the next 10 minutes were going to go. The leverage was confirmed. The trap was set. Now all I had to do was press play. I didn't move toward the fireplace immediately. I stayed in the shadow of the hallway, watching the room. It was a study in false comfort. Richard was in his element. He had transitioned from the stoic widower to the gracious host. He was moving between groups, a glass of Chardonnay in one hand, his other hand landing frequently on people's shoulders. He looked lighter than I'd seen him in years. Every time someone offered a condolence, he'd tilt his head, give a small, sad smile, and say something about carrying on for Claire's sake. He was already moving into his next life, and he was using the sympathy of 40 people as his fuel. I saw him corner my cousin David near the buffet. Richard leaned in, his voice dropping to that confidential, fatherly tone. "I'm worried about the house, David. Elena has. Well, she's made some threats. I think the grief has unmoored her. I might have to change the locks again tonight just for safety. It breaks my heart." David nodded, his face hardening as he looked toward the kitchen. "You've done enough, Uncle Richard. If she causes trouble, I'll help you handle it. She's being ungrateful." Richard patted David's arm, a small, triumphant glint in his eyes that he didn't quite hide fast enough. He thought he'd built a wall around me. He thought that by Monday, I'd be gone, $214,000 in debt to a phantom account, while he flew to Boca Raton to toast his new condo with Monica. I reached into my pocket and felt the cool, heavy metal of the flash drive. My thumb traced the industrial casing. I looked at the 65-inch screen above the fireplace. It was currently scrolling through a loop of photos Richard had curated. Mom in the garden, Mom at Christmas, Mom smiling at the camera while Richard stood behind her, looking like a protective oak. It was a beautiful lie. I checked my watch. 4:45 p.m. In 15 minutes, the catering staff would begin clearing the plates. The window was closing. I stepped out of the hallway. The room didn't go silent immediately, but the temperature seemed to drop. People noticed me, the daughter in the wrinkled black dress, the erratic one who had supposedly been making threats. They shifted their bodies, creating a physical barrier between me and the martyr at the center of the room. Richard saw me. He didn't flinch. He just straightened his posture and put on a look of weary patience. "Elena," he said, his voice projecting to the corners of the room. "I'm glad you've calmed down. Come, have a seat. We were just about to share a final toast." He gestured to a folding chair near the back, the kind of seat you give to a latecomer or an afterthought. "I'm not here for a seat, Dad," I said. My voice was quiet, but it had a frequency that cut through the murmurs. "And I think the slideshow is missing a few slides, important ones." Richard's smile didn't falter, but his eyes went cold. "This isn't the time for your outbursts, Elena. Let your mother have her peace." "I am letting her have her peace," I said, walking toward the fireplace. "I'm letting her have the last word." I saw Aunt Helen move to the side of the room near the light switches. She gave me a single, sharp nod. I reached the TV. I didn't look at the crowd. I didn't look at the white golf shoes my father was wearing. I looked at the USB port. "24 hours ago, you told me I was a tenant," I said, my hand hovering near the screen. "You told me I owed you for a sacrifice you never made. I think everyone should see what that sacrifice actually looked like." Richard started toward me, his face flushing a deep, angry purple. "Elena, step away from the television, now." "Don't touch her, Richard," Helen's voice rang out from the back. The room froze. Richard stopped mid-stride, his glass trembling slightly. The 40 guests held their reception plates like shields, their eyes darting between the father and the daughter. I plugged the drive into the port. The screen went black for a heartbeat. Then a new menu appeared. One folder. One file. I didn't argue. I didn't beg. I pressed play. The room didn't just go silent, it went hollow. The kind of silence that happens right before a car crash. The image of my mother filled the 65-inch screen. It wasn't the sick, fading woman they'd seen in the hospital bed. This was Claire from 6 months ago, pale, yes, but her eyes were sharp, her voice steady. She was sitting at the oak desk in the office, the same one Richard had been looting the night she died. "If you're watching this," Mom said, her voice echoing off the high ceilings of the living room, "it means Richard has finally run out of lies and Elena has finally run out of patience." Richard moved. He didn't just walk, he lunged. He dropped his wine glass, it shattered against the hearth, red liquid spraying across his white golf shoes, and reached for the back of the TV, his hands clawing for the power cord. "Turn it off," he screamed. His voice wasn't the smooth, practiced baritone of the grieving widower anymore. It was thin and jagged. She was out of her mind, the medication, she didn't know what she was filming. He almost reached the wires. But he forgot that he'd spent 30 years treating his younger brother, my Uncle Tom, like a hired hand. Tom, a man who usually never spoke above a murmur, stepped out of the crowd. He didn't say a word. He just put a hand on Richard's chest and shoved him. It wasn't a gentle push. Richard hit the wall with a thud that made the framed family photos rattle. "Don't you touch it, Richard," Tom said. He stood between my father and the screen, his jaw set. "Let her finish. For once in your life, let her finish." The room watched, paralyzed. Reception plates were forgotten. My cousin David, who had been Richard's bouncer an hour ago, was staring at the screen, his face draining of color. On the screen, Mom began to hold up papers. "Richard likes to talk about sacrifice," Mom said. A bank statement appeared on the screen, a high-resolution scan. "He told our daughter he drained his retirement, but here is the statement from his 401k. Not a single withdrawal in 3 years. And here, she switched to a different document, is the ledger for the household care fund. Alina, honey, I am so sorry. You were depositing $3,000 a month into this account. Within 24 hours of every deposit, your father was wiring that money to an escrow account for a condominium in Boca Raton. A collective gasp hissed through the room. It was the sound of 40 reputations for Richard Townsend evaporating at once. The address is 412 Ocean Breeze, Mom continued, her voice clinical. It's held in the name of Richard Townsend and Monica Vance. Richard, I hope the view is worth it. Because you're going to be looking at it from a prison cell if Alina decides to audit you. Richard was back on his feet, but he looked smaller. He looked like a suit with no man inside it. He looked at the crowd, his eyes darting from face to face, searching for the support that had been there all morning. She was delusional, he shouted, pointing at the screen. She was jealous. She made these up to spite me because I was the one who had to handle the mess. David, you know how she was, tell them. David didn't say a word. He looked at the bank statement on the screen, then at the shattered glass on the hearth, then at me. He took 2 steps back, physically distancing himself from the man he'd been protecting. The video shifted. It wasn't just documents anymore. It was a montage of caregiver support group nights. Mom had used her phone to record the security feed from the front porch. The timestamps matched the nights I was home, crushing pills into applesauce. There was Richard, leaving in a tuxedo while telling me he was going to a grief seminar. There was Richard returning at 3:00 a.m., laughing with a blonde woman in the driveway, leaning against the car I was currently paying the insurance on. The final image on the screen wasn't a document. It was a photo of the deed to the house. The house belongs to Alina, Mom's voice said, now softer, almost a whisper. I moved it into her name 2 weeks ago. Richard, you have no claim. You have no money, you have no daughter. Alina, take the keys. They're in the blue vase in the foyer. I love you. The screen went black. The silence that followed was heavy, suffocating. 40 people were staring at Richard. The martyr was gone. In his place stood a man who had stolen from his dying wife and his only child to fund a mistress in Florida. Richard tried one last time. He straightened his tie. He tried to reclaim the baritone. Now, let's be reasonable. This is a private family matter. If we could all just get out. The voice came from the back of the room. It was Mrs. Gable, the woman who had avoided me in the church lobby. She was standing by the front door, her coat already on. Get out of this house, Richard, she said, her voice trembling with rage. You used us. You used our prayers. You used our food. You're a thief. One by one, the guests began to move. They didn't leave quietly. They left with a clatter of plates being dropped onto tables, with disgusted looks thrown over shoulders. My cousins walked out without looking at him. The pastor, the man who had praised Richard's lone sacrifice, didn't even say goodbye. He just looked at the floor and walked out the door. In 3 minutes, the room was empty of everyone except me, Richard, Uncle Tom, and Aunt Helen. Richard looked at me. The mask was entirely gone now. The devoted father had been replaced by a cornered animal. You think you're so smart, he spat, his voice low and venomous. You think you can just kick me out? I've lived here for 30 years. You have 20 minutes to pack a bag, I said. I wasn't shouting. I felt a strange, cold clarity. The police are already on their way. I called them 5 minutes after I pressed play. I'm reporting the unauthorized access to my bank accounts and the illegal transfer of funds. Alina, 19 minutes, Richard, I said. I looked at the dirt still on my shoes, the dirt from the grave he'd used as a prop. And take the golf shoes. You're going to be doing a lot of walking. He stared at me for a long beat, his face contorting into something unrecognizable. Then he turned and ran up the stairs. I sat down in the folding chair he'd offered me earlier, the one at the back of the room, the one for the afterthought. I watched the clock on the mantelpiece. It was 5:12 p.m. on Monday. I was going to change the locks for the last time. The police arrived exactly 19 minutes later. They didn't need to do much. Richard was standing in the driveway, two expensive leather suitcases at his feet and his designer golf bag slung over his shoulder. He tried to tell them it was a civil dispute, but Uncle Tom stood on the porch with a printed copy of the deed and the transfer of ownership. I watched through the front window as they escorted him to a cab. He didn't look back. He didn't look like a martyr. He looked like a man who had suddenly realized that a 65-inch screen can be a very large mirror. The fallout was a slow, quiet crumbling. By the following Sunday, the news had traveled through the church, the country club, and the neighborhood. Richard's phone stopped ringing. The grief counselor, Monica, disappeared the moment the Boca Raton condo was frozen by a preliminary injunction. Turns out, when the money stops flowing, the support dries up pretty fast. Richard is currently living in a studio apartment above a dry cleaner's 3 towns over. He's facing a civil suit for the $214,000 he siphoned from my accounts, and the DA is looking into the Medicare fraud. His social world has shrunk to the size of a postage stamp. At the local diner where he used to be the good guy, people now look at their menus when he walks in. There is always an empty chair at the table next to him. Uncle Tom and Aunt Helen stayed for the first week to help me scrub the house. Not just the floors, but the memory of him. We changed the locks, we repainted the guest room, and we donated every single one of his silk ties to a thrift store. On Sunday morning, the first Sunday of my new life, I sat on the back porch with Aunt Helen. The rain from the funeral had cleared, leaving the air sharp and smelling of wet cedar. We weren't talking about spreadsheets or bank statements, we were just sitting. Helen handed me a mug of coffee. It was one of Mom's favorites, a chipped ceramic one with a faded painting of a white lily on the side. "What are you going to do with the extra rooms?" Helen asked softly. I looked back at the house. It was quiet, it was safe. It didn't feel like a cage or a hospital anymore. It felt like a home. "I think I'm going to turn the office into a library," I said, "and I'm going to plant a real garden, no carnations, just lilies, as many as I can fit." I reached into my pocket and pulled out the heavy metal flash drive. I set it on the small table between our chairs. It sat there in the sunlight, reflecting the blue of the sky. It wasn't a weapon anymore. It was just a piece of hardware. Right next to it was a framed photo of Mom. She was laughing, her hair blowing in the wind, looking exactly like the woman who had built a key for her daughter while the world was trying to lock her in. I'm still tired. Some days, I still look at my bank balance and expect to see zeros. But then I look at the deed on the mantelpiece and the keys in my hand, and I remember that the dirt on my shoes is finally gone. I have one question for you. If you found out your parent was using your grief to fund a secret life, would you have waited for a public room to reveal the truth? Or would you have walked away in silence and let them keep their mask?